So in this next webinar, we're going to talk about attachments. And attachments are really just arbitrary data files that can be attached to a transaction. So how do they work? So as I said, transactions can contain a number of attachments, and these are typically zip files, and they're identified by hash. Crucially, actually, these attachments are not necessarily contained within the transaction, but the hashes of the bytes of the attachment are contained within the transaction. So they're just referenced via hash as opposed to included within the transaction itself. But of course, the Corda nodes need a mechanism to be able to deal with users uploading attachments and syndicating attachments to other nodes along with transactions. So attachments are typically intended for data that will be reused over and over again, maybe something like a holiday calendar or some historical FX rates, or even some contract code itself. And lastly here, a transaction creator would choose which files that they want to attach to their transaction proposal. So typically what you do is when you want to include an attachment in a transaction, you'll take the hash of that attachment and include it in the list of attachment hashes. So now with this transaction here, you've got the inputs, outputs, commands, time windows, attachments, and signatures. And this is a complete transaction now. These are the 5 things that you can add to transactions: input states, output states, commands, time windows, and attachments. When we finish covering attachments, then that's all there is to know for transactions. And of course, your signatures are applied over the whole transaction hash and appended to the transaction and not stored within it. So what can an attachment actually contain? There's 3 things. So the contract code. So interestingly, you will be able to syndicate contract code around the network via attachments and the associated state definitions as well. If you have to verify a transaction whereby you do not have the contract code or the state definition, then you need a mechanism to obtain that contract code and state definition, and you can do that via an attachment within the transaction. It can also contain arbitrary data files, which we discussed on the previous slide. If you have an attachment as some contract code, how do you restrict what code you're willing to run? And there's a number of ways to do this. So a state can say, well, I'll only take hash 4FD0B5, and that's the only hash, contract code hash I will use to govern how I can evolve over time. Or maybe you would say, I will only use a contract if it has been signed by a particular public key. Or maybe you would say, I will use potentially a set of contract hashes. So maybe this is to take into account versioning and backwards compatibility of contract versions. So there can be a number of ways for a state to specify which contract code it would allow to verify transactions involving it. You can also have attachments which contain data, but so the attachments are dumb in the sense that they just contain data and they don't necessarily perform any verification over it. That verification would have to be contained within the contract code itself. So the contract code will have a means to access the attachments within a transaction and perform verification over the data in the attachment. But crucially, they would not be able to access anything else outside of the transaction object that we looked at in the contracts webinar. So the contract code can impose some basic restrictions on what type of data it's willing to include. Maybe it will only take a PDF file or some machine readable data structure, and potentially it can impose some size limits on those files as well. So what does it look like in terms of a Corda transaction involving attachments? How do these various types of attachments interact with each other? So potentially you could have some contract code and static reference data as attachments. Typically what would happen is you would have the states that reference the contract code by hash. This is the contract code that governs how those states evolve over time. And then you could have the contract code which again references some static reference data like FX rates, for instance, or some machine readable data structures which you need to verify transactions. And again, there can be constraints placed around the attachments which the contract code is willing to accept. So just to finish off, attachments are zip files that are referenced in a transaction but not included within the transaction itself. So when you produce the transaction, you just include the attachment hash. However, it's worth noting that when you come to verify a transaction, you need all of the data referenced from that transaction to be able to verify it. Therefore, any input states or attachments that are referenced in the transaction are resolved, and the hashes are replaced with the actual input states and actual attachments themselves. So only when you come to verify a transaction do you get access to the attachments and input states. Otherwise, the input states and hashes are just references. Input state references to prior output states, and hashes to which are references to actual attachments themselves.